Hello, am I here? Yo, what is going on, guys? I just finished editing this video, and it is super long, so I just wanted to do a better job of explaining what's going on at the beginning. This is me taking you through setting up my Blender default file, which contains a ton of tips and tricks on how to just be more efficient. So I go through stuff like UI. I tell you all of the add-ons I use, and all of that is timestamped in the description. So you should just be able to either click a timestamp, or you can just scroll through and see kind of what you're looking at if one particular thing interests you, like my render settings or anything like that. A lot of the areas of this video are going to get their own video, but I wanted to just compile this into here's what I do in Blender. So that is what this is, and I hope you enjoy. Yo, what is going on, guys? My name is Jared, and today I would like to make a video about some tips and tricks to help you get faster in Blender in 2023. Efficiency is something that has been a big theme on my channel. I like building systems that work and help you work faster. Efficiency is important in any professional field, and so today I want to go through my Blender startup file, and I'm actually going to nuke this file right here and rebuild it with you, just to kind of show you the things that I do to set myself up for efficiency in all of my professional work. So this is what my Blender file looks like. We are basically going to be rebuilding this from scratch today. I load in with, cameras and focus objects already linked up, and there's a default HDRI that I use for a lot of things. I have my asset browser down here that, all kinds of stuff lives in. And so I'm able to open this file and work really fast, and I want to teach you how to do it. So I'm going to go to File, Defaults, Load Factory Settings, and now we have a normal, regular Blender file. And I'm going to go ahead and just double down and save this as my startup so that I can truly rebuild my startup file with you. So there are going to be a couple different things that we go through here. I'm going to start by, I guess, let's delete everything first. So I'm going to delete everything in the default scene. I'm going to come up to my render settings, and why don't we go ahead and just run through render settings pretty fast, because those are fairly simple. Eevee, I leave my Blender file opening in Eevee by default, but I set my render samples to 128. I leave my viewport at 16, or actually I even cut them to 8, and leave viewport denoising enabled. Ambient occlusion I turn on. Bloom, screen space reflections, and motion blur. Screen space reflections, sorry. I open up and turn on refraction by default because there's not a large reason not to. Performance, I don't turn on high quality normals by default, so that all looks good. Color management, leave on filmic, and then I'll set it to high contrast by default. I do not use curves in my Eevee scene, so I will switch over to cycles really quick, and we will switch this to experimental and GPU compute. If you don't have a GPU, you can leave it on CPU, but in general, GPU compute is going to be most helpful. Sampling, as far as cycles go, in the viewport, I turn this down to 64, and I turn on denoise. In the render, normally I'm going to render a bunch of previews first, so my initial settings are going to be a little low. Noise threshold, there's a whole video that I could do about the technical side of render settings, but noise threshold I generally turn up to 0.05, and that's just going to give me faster renders. That's just going to raise that bar that Blender sets to basically when it says this is a clean enough image, it's going to raise that bar so that things are a lot faster than they are at 0.01. Max samples, I'm going to put to 256, and I will also leave denoising on there. Color management, I'll leave on high contrast. I'll turn on use curves, and I generally put like just the slightest of S curves in here by default because contrast is my friend, and it's your friend too. So those I think are basically my default render settings. I do turn on motion blur, and then I just leave that on its default settings. And so that is that's pretty much my render settings done. So if all you want to do is set your render settings, you come up to File, Default, Save Startup File. Oh, I didn't actually click it. Default Save Startup File. And you can do that throughout this entire process because you know, you can do that at any point in time. Let me hit in. Okay, so a lot of plugins are gone, which is totally fine. We will next jump into the user interface side of this, making our user interface a lot more usable, I guess. I like to not have to switch my layout to do anything by default. I like to be able to reach basically everything important within reason. And so I add to this default layout up here, I add a lot of panels. So I'm going to come up to this little, the corner up here where I can get my little crosshair, and I'm going to pull this out to create a new panel. I will pull this to somewhere like right here. And I will switch this to a shader editor by default. And I'm going to hit in here to get rid of this panel that comes up. Don't need any of that. So this is my shader editor. So if I, have a cube in here, I can go ahead and edit shaders right here in my standard viewport, so I don't have to go over to the shading tab. So that is nice. And then I will come down here, get my little crosshair in the right-hand corner, and drag up another window right here. And in this window right here, I switch it back to a 3D viewport, but I am going to hit Shift-A and add in a camera, because we're going to need one of those eventually anyways. And in this viewport over here, I will hit 0. Well, actually, I guess since we nuked our preferences, I need to come out to Edit, Preferences, Input, Emulate Numpad, because the keyboard that I use at home does not have a numpad. I will hit 0 to go into my camera. And then I'm going to turn a whole bunch of stuff off. So I'm going to hit T to turn that off. I don't need my gizmos, and I don't want any overlays. So basically, this window right here is just meant to always show me my my camera view, and it's not really meant to change at all. So once I start to get a scene where, like, it's looking good and I'm adding in lighting and stuff, I will just flip this over to rendered view, and then I just have a little view of what my camera sees constantly, and I can freely move around this viewport. To continue after this, I'm going to go ahead and do some stuff to my camera. So first, I'm going to select my camera. I'll hit in and come up to item, and then I want this to rotation to be 90 on the x-axis, y to be 0, and z to be 0. And then I will move this back on the y-axis, so that is just GY, and I click and drag because generally my camera is going to be roughly in this position. I'm going to switch my resolution to 3000 by 3000, and I'm going to set it to 50%. And while we are on this with the camera stuff, I'll go ahead and go through this frame rate at 24. That's pretty much always the case. My frame range I set to 350 because slowed down to 24 frames a second. That's approximately what I do for social media animations. Output, I'm going to come back to output and continue working on user interface. This is future editing Jared here to tell you that I never came back to output. I totally forgot. So really quickly in file output, I leave it as temp to start. PNG, I switch my settings to 16 and 0 for compression. Overwrite can stay on for an image sequence. Color management follows the scene. PNG, I will switch now to JPEG, RGB, 100% quality. Whenever I render out a JPEG, I want it to be like that. And then FFmpeg, we will come down into encoding. Set this to MPEG 4. H.264, I think, is still standard. Yeah, there's no H.265 here, so H.264. High quality, encoding speed good, all fine. Generally, this is just something I use for previews anyways, so that's good. And then I'll flip it back to PNG, 16-bit, and yeah, those are my output settings. That's all there is to it. So, the next thing that I'm going to do is come down to this corner over here and drag up, oh, I went a little too slow, drag up a new window. I'm going to set this to my asset browser, and I leave this closed by default down here. I want it to be easily accessible, but I don't want like all of these panels open. It's a little overwhelming. I leave my asset browser just kind of hidden down here. It's pretty rare that I click tools up here, so by default I hit T and have my tool view closed. That's completely personal preference. If you click tools a lot, you can, or if you annotate a lot, you can leave that on. And this is more or less the scene that I open up to, or at least the UI that I open up to for every new Blender file that I create. And now what we're gonna do is come up here and clean up some of these because you don't need them, and you can reorder the ones that you do need. I don't do a ton of modeling, so I'm going to delete the modeling tab. Same with sculpting. Same with UV editing, because I'm about to edit my shading tab where UV editing is included. Texture paint, same deal. Shading, I'm going to come in here and do some editing. So I'm going to right click in the middle of these two panels and click join areas and do that. And then I would like to also join these areas. Generally in my shader editor, I will have my UV tab down here. So I will come over here, create a new panel, and add in my UV editor. And I like to keep that here and my file browser here because I work with a lot of image textures. I have to go find them. I don't want to drag them from, one of these Explorer windows. And so then I have this big panel up here that I get to actually view my shading in. I have plenty of space for my shader editor here. And for UV scaling and stuff, I have a tiny little window right here, which is plenty to do that. Okay, so that is my shading tab. Animation. This is a tab that I use a ton. I'm going to switch this guy down here to a graph editor because I use that a lot more than a dope sheet personally. So this is approximately what I do for my animation window. Rendering, I leave the same. Compositing, I open a new window right here. And I'll switch this to the image editor. And so basically what that does is when you have a render result, you can come up here and put your render result in this so that you don't have to use that viewer node and then like do all your nodes on top of your image. You can just view your render result over here and all of your changes that you make in your compositing will be reflected. And then generally I don't composite animation in Blender, so I close this down for the time being. That is kind of all I use. I'm about to dive into learning geometry nodes, so I'm sure I'll need this at some point, but I'm going to delete that, and then I don't ever do scripting, so I'm going to delete that. So that is basically the entire UI portion of this video. I'm going to come over here and do File, Save Startup File, just to save our progress. And we've already got a pretty killer file in the works. I'm going to walk you through the plugins that I use and do some Blender preferences. So I'll come up to Edit, Preferences. I already turned on Emulate Numpad. Viewport, all of this stays the same. Light stays the same. Editing stays the same. Animation, you can change your default interpolation here. I leave it on Bezier. I used to have it on linear, but now I do a lot of like speed ramping and stuff, so I leave it on Bezier or Bezier. Add-ons, if I tick enabled only, yeah, so all of my add-ons were turned off, which is not a problem because it's going to let me go through and show you what they are anyways. So these are all the ones that come by default with Cinema 4D. I'm going to first and foremost search for Node Wrangler. And while I'm in here, I will turn on Node Presets and Arrange. Node Wrangler is obviously probably the #1 most used plugin in Blender. ANC, or I guess let me search. Landscape, you want landscape meshes, and then I'm going to search extra, and I want both extra objects and extra curves. That's just going to give you extra options in your initial Shift-A menu. Images as planes is something that I use a ton, so I have to be sure that that is on. And I'm going to come down here while I'm at it. I'm going to be sure that autosave preferences is checked, so that all of this gets saved as I go. Another one that I use pretty frequently is Magic UV for doing all kinds of UV unwraps and copy and pasting UVs and all kinds of stuff like that. And I think those are all of the default ones that I use from out-of-the-box Blender. Let me make sure that like SVG, yeah, SVG importer is already on, GLTF, FBX, okay. All of those import things are on by default. So now I'll go into paid add-ons. Well, I guess some are probably free. I don't really remember. I'll just go into the add-ons that I use every day. I have a ton of add-ons installed, but I do not keep them all on because there are only a few that I use very frequently. So I will start to just kind of go through some of those. Add-ons, I know can and should be like an entire video all on its own, but for those who are curious, I'm just going to go through and turn on what I use. I do use Scatter 5 a lot. Scattering plugin for scattering all kinds of objects and biomes onto planes and objects and whatnot. Kit ops I do not use very often. Polygon I use a ton. The Polygon add-on lets you just bring in super high quality assets straight from Polygon's library. Super useful, use it a lot, mostly for simple textures and stuff. Simple tabs is something that I use to rearrange my end panel. It lets you like move things up and down and do all kinds of stuff like that. Just since this is, there's no way to do that without simple tabs. Let's see, Wiggle Geo. This is basically like a Cinema 4D vibrate tag. It lets you put slight wiggles on, or like slight noise variations, I guess, onto your keyframes, like particularly position, rotation, and scale, just to give a little bit of slight variation into that. You can also use it on cameras for pretty organic camera shake. Let me scroll through here. I don't see anything yet that I use. Flip Fluids, I use a lot. That is the best plugin for doing fluid animation in Blender. QShot, I don't use too much anymore. Cam Effects by B Production, I believe that's their name. Yeah, B Production. Cam Effects, I use a lot. It does some really cool bokeh simulation stuff. It It's a simple add-on that just makes a manual task a little faster, but it creates some really cool camera effects. Just rolling on through here. Pure Sky used to use a lot, don't really anymore. Vegetation, also by B Production, tons of plant assets, like drag and drop. It's insane. Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, I like a lot. I also like True VFX's Sky and Atmosphere plugin. So I know that I use other things from TrueFX, so I think that's the one that I'm going to turn on. But Physical Starlight and Atmosphere is one of the best Sky plugins for Blender, period. Real-Time Materials I used to use a lot by Ducky 3D. I don't use that stuff anymore. Some of them are a little too like rudimentary for my use, but it's a great plugin for people who need some quick materials. Machine Tools I use a lot, and I will actually toggle this down and show you what I use. So Machine Tools is basically meant to make it creates different pie menus in Blender, a lot of which are useful for different things. So I know that there's a lot of them, a lot of really good ones for modeling and stuff like that. I really only use the save pie, which when I hit Control S now, it brings up I can save, incremental save, save as, and then import both OBJ and FBX from import and export, which is a big deal just from this little pie menu. It's easily like my most used Blender tool, this right here, especially the incremental save, all the time. Go back up to my preferences. So that is what I use Machine Tools for. Scrolly scroll, Machine Tools, there we go. Align Tools, use it all the time. Pretty self-explanatory there, just aligns a group of selected objects. I use both True Terrain, True VDB. Getting an error on that. I'll figure out what that is. But these are all by True VFX. True VFX, you can just go to their Blender Market page, and they have, I think everything that they do is pretty good, to be honest. That might be it. I used to use Turbo Tools a lot. I'm going to turn on True Sky. That's the True VFX Sky plugin that I was talking about. Turbo Tools I used to use a lot for rendering stuff, and then I just like learned more about optimizing render settings by myself. But if you're someone who doesn't know a ton about render settings, Turbo Tools is actually like they simplify it a lot. I mostly stopped using Turbo Tools because I wanted to cut down the amount of third-party stuff that I used overall, because I obviously use plenty as it is, but this is a fantastic tool. I think that is all of my preferences. Input, let me just see. Emulate 3-button mouse, I do not use that. Navigation, all good here. Key map, cool. System. System, you need to switch to optics, and I don't use my CPU, just my GPU. You can crank your undo steps. That's helpful sometimes to 64 or so. It'll use a little bit of memory, but that is not a big deal compared to being able to undo. And then file paths, asset libraries. I'll relink all my asset libraries another time. I need to do a video updating my old asset library video anyways, because I've gotten a lot better at using it. So I believe that that is all in this portion of the video. So those are all plugins I use. If this is what my end panel looks like at any given time. This is a ton of useful stuff that helps me create my scenes really, really fast. The last thing to do here is a little bit of scene setup. So you saw at the beginning that I have stuff like default camera, default HDRI, focus objects, all that kind of stuff. And so that's the last thing that I'm going to do now that I pretty much always have set up in Blender. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a couple of new collections. I'm just going to come up here and click C to create a new collection. I'm going to call this lighting, and I will put this in, I guess, just the main scene collection. This collection that my camera's in, I'll rename to cameras, because a lot of times you'll have a lot of camera stuff, and having a folder for it is good. I will make cameras red, make lighting yellow, and then I'll hit C one more time, and I will make a scene and objects that, you know, most of my scene will go into outside of production, and I'll make that green. And that's pretty much my my file structure. It's a little basic, but it at least gets every project started. As far as cameras go, I'm gonna come into my camera, change a couple settings. I'm gonna make this an 85mm lens. Clip start is gonna be 0.01. That's the distance that your camera starts clipping based on like how close you are to an object. Sensor fit, fine. Safe areas, fine. Viewport display. I take the, what is that word? I basically make the the edges of like outside a camera black, so that even when I'm here, there's no transparency. I can't see like the edges of this scene that won't be in frame. I only see what's in frame. What an odd word that is. Depth of field I turn on. I set it to 22 by default so that it's super high. And then I will hit Shift A, add in an empty plane axis. And this is going to be my focus object. I will put it in here in my camera thing. And then I'll call this cam 1. Because different cameras, if you're animating, will need different focus objects. And then in depth of field here, I will just set that to my focus object, and then I turn it off because I want this to be set, but I don't want to have depth of field by default. That is pretty much the camera setup. In my lighting folder, I always keep an infinite background. So to make an infinite background, we've done it on the channel before. We go mesh, Shift A, mesh plane, come over here, tab into edit mode, select our back two vertices, EZ to move on the Z axis or extrude on the Z axis. Grab the back two vertices again, Control B, widen it out, scroll, let go, tab back into object mode, shade smooth, and then I keep this in here and turn it off. Speaking of turning things off, come up to your filters and add in your disable in viewports, because that will disable certain things in your viewport, but leave them present in your render. That's a helpful little tick box to have. So, but I turn this background off, and I will rename it infinite background. So I always have that going on. And so then I think the last thing that we need to do, at least for most people, is we will add in a default world texture to give your scenes some life off the bat and get you creating quicker, at least in kind of look development. So in order to pull this off, I'm going to disconnect this background, add in an environment texture. I will open one, we'll go databases, Grayscale Gorilla. This is an HDRI that I like to use by default. It is called Afternoon Cafe. It just has some really good dynamic light without being too overwhelming. Control T to set up mapping with Node Wrangler that we put in here earlier. Shift A, I do hue saturation. Alt right click and drag. That is how I did that little lazy connection. Saturation 0.1. Don't want really any saturation, and so then you can either plug this in directly to the surface, or you can Actually, you would plug it into the background color and then into the surface. Or if you want a colored background instead of this, when you load it in, you can do Shift A background, add in a mix, add in a mix shader. Put your background color into the bottom shader, your HDRI into the top, and then in the factor, you want a light path, and then that will be is camera ray by default. Connect that to your surface, and now you can change this background color to whatever you need. Mine will always be black. Okay, then I'll switch this back to clay, or not to clay, but to, you know, just viewport shading. And that is my default HDRI setup. And that's my default Blender file. I hope that this has been a pretty long video, probably. I hope that you learned something. I hope that something helped along the way. This is how I set up everything from... You know, this is how I know to be efficient in Blender. If you have any tips for me based on my file, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you learned something. And yeah, I will see you in the next video.